Today I have a very special guest. This is my friend Trevor, based out of Utah, and we're going to jump straight into basically negative patterns within relationships and kind of how to break out of those patterns, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're looking at.
All right, so a quick intro for Trevor. Trevor, you are blowing up all over social media, which is fantastic. Congratulations, well deserved. Trevor is a licensed associate MFT. I have to say associate in there for legal purposes. For how long though?
Well, until I fully license, which I mean, secretly, I'm a little bit torn because there's just some limitations. I mean, there's some credibility in being a therapist, but there's also some
Yeah.
limitations. And so, at least for about a year, I have to use the word associate. But I do practice. I see clients in my office and do all the therapy things. But there's some supervision requirements and stuff at this point in my journey.
Well, for anyone watching or listening, Trevor is legit. We don't have anybody on the podcast that we don't wholeheartedly buy into and support. What you're doing is incredible. We're going to talk a bit later about your connection course. And why don't we just go straight into kind of negative patterns? And you kind of brought up, this is a subject that you're actually studying quite a bit right now, right?
Yeah. Something I'm pretty passionate about. Yeah.
Tell me.
It's this idea. So if you're familiar with different therapy type models, a lot of this concept is drawn from emotionally focused therapy. And if you're a therapist listening, or if you're a big buff in all this, you're going to know for the most part, if you're couples therapist, you probably fall into Gottman camp or emotionally focused therapy. They're the most research backed and evidence based at this point, right? Core value therapy is probably going to be coming up there and sneaking in there pretty soon, right?
Maybe in a decade.
But they're the most evidence based, and so I've been training in emotionally focused therapy, and there's this concept that is incredibly helpful. Something I worked through on session number 1 or 2 with a couple, and it is this idea that says there is an actual pattern behind your disconnection. It's not just some nuanced chaos that runs in the background, which it feels that way because in the moment it's how did we get here again? You're looking across the room at your partner and you're I know I love her, but how in the freaking world are we back here where we're either screaming at each other, or maybe it's not that hardcore, maybe it's just the little bickering, or you get to a place where you're ignoring each other and you're how in the world did we get here? Well, helping people to actually map out a pattern and see oh, when you do this, it creates this in me, and when it creates that in me, I do this and that creates this in you, and we can start to actually draw it. And it's funny, I'll draw it on a whiteboard throughout a session, and by the end everyone's oh my gosh, this is so cool, I want to take a picture of that. They're snapping pictures, taking it home, and it makes a huge difference just knowing that. And that's the tip of the iceberg as far as really getting into it, but that's the concept, is being able to map out and understand your own patterns, which I think is 99% of therapy, is just knowing what's going on. Oh, wow, I do that really stupid thing that doesn't work very well. I will now change that because now I get it. I see the impact. So that's kind of the concept behind mapping out the negative patterns within a relationship.
Yeah, so much of therapy is basically just shining a light into darkness, right?
Totally.
It's just brightening up areas of the room that we weren't paying attention to. But that's also part of I almost feel that's also one of the most difficult things of it, because for a lot of people, shining a light into those areas that they're doing wrong presents issues in terms of do they want to be accountable for it? Do they want to own up to something, or are they going to avoid?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the hard part, is that there is some pain of recognition and accountability. And I think it's hard because in ways, it depends on how we've learned how to cope with some sort of feedback. I don't even want to call it criticism, but just awareness of something that we're doing that doesn't work. I think how we've learned how to cope with that will greatly impact how we cope in our relationships when we're not doing right things, or be when a light is shined on one of those things. Because some people will go to shame, right? Oh, I'm an idiot. I'm the worst. I'm a bad person. And it feels like justice. It feels like accountability. If I can say I'm a total loser, then that makes up for it. And it's well, actually, that's not the truth. First of all, you're not a total loser. You're not an idiot. So that's not the answer. Which, if you put it that way, I start to go, that's not only, for the type who aren't so bought into like the lovey-dovey compassionate language, which I buy into a lot of that, but for those who are just like, hey, I
I'm
want
probably on the other side of it.
yeah, I do kind of a back and forth, but for those who are just
Yeah.
like effective versus ineffective, like tell me, why is shame not okay? Because it feels good to call myself a loser. And I go,
Yeah.
well, dude, you're just missing the whole point. Like the truth underneath why you maybe criticize, or maybe why you stonewall or get super defensive, or all these negative things that are part of the negative patterns, it's way beneath like you thinking you're a loser. Like you're actually not. It might be because of an
Hmm.
insecurity, a fear, a longing, like something a little deeper in there. And so it kind of depends on how we've, I guess, learned to cope with feedback like that, on how we respond.
For sure.
Yeah.
So going into it, maybe we can start kind of naming some of these patterns that we might
Yeah.
recognize. But you named one of them right there. You mentioned stonewalling within a
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah, totally. So if you think about, so I'm going to give you kind of a generalization, and this isn't true for everybody, but a lot of the data shows this, and this is what I see in my office, is that there's two sides to a pattern, and I'll kind of just draw this out. Almost imagine visually that you're looking at like a figure eight or like an infinity loop cycle, and it's tipped over it on its side, so it intersects right in the middle. If you're drawing it like on a paper or a whiteboard, and on one side
Hmm.
that represents you, and then the other side represents your partner. And typically, in male-female partner relationships, men are more likely to, their negative part of their negative pattern is they're going to withdraw and stonewall and shut down. More likely. It doesn't mean that it's always
Hmm.
true.
Hmm.
Females are more likely to pursue and criticize, and blame. Again, not always true. If I had to
Hmm.
pick a camp, and those are different spectrums. You can be really critical, or you can be really stonewalling and withdrawing, or you can be on the low end. I'm on that spectrum. Everyone's on that spectrum. I'm on the low end of critical. So I kind of break that norm, and my wife is on the low end of withdraw. And you usually see this where you get a critical, more pursuer matched up
Hmm.
with a withdrawer. And how it turns into a negative cycle is they start coping with the distress in the relationship by doing their move. It's like, my move is to withdraw. Okay, my move is to criticize. I'm going to do that because I want to try to cope with what's happening here. It's my quote unquote attempted solution. It's not a good solution,
Hmm.
but it's an attempted one. And so the story kind of goes like this. Let's say whoever he is, he withdraws, due to some sort of uncomfortable feeling, some sort of conflict, something. He's withdrawing. And what happens for her is that she gets all these messages from that. And the messages sound like, he doesn't love me. I'm not good enough. He doesn't care. I'm unimportant. He's going to leave me. Maybe this is going to, and then it turns into fear. Man, maybe this is going to go on forever. I mean, he is going to leave me. Maybe he really doesn't care about me. And underneath that, she also has longings and needs, such as, just for him to be present, for him to be involved. And the way she copes with that is says, I got to fix this. So I got to claw, kind of, I almost imagine claws. Like I got to reach out and like
Hmm.
claw him back here, tell him like what he's doing wrong to keep him close. Like, hey, I need you to do this. What she's trying to say is, I need these things. I long for these things, but she's not saying that. She's just saying, you always shut down, you withdraw, you, and it's critical. Shoot, they're both doing really disconnecting things. And he receives maybe similar messages. He's not going to ever get it right. He's not good enough for her.
Hmm.
He's always missing the mark. Maybe she's going to one day get fed up and just leave him because he's just not measuring up. And he has fears that those things might happen. And he also has longings. Man, I long to feel appreciated or understood. Meanwhile, they never talk about their actual longings, about their actual fears, about what's actually going on. All they see is usually, and if we go back to our figure eight, if we draw a line horizontally through it, on the top of the line is what we see, on the bottom of the line is what we don't see. What we don't see is the longings, the fears, the needs, the insecurities, the messages that come across. What we do see is anger and the disconnecting behavior that's above the criticism, the withdrawal, and all of that. And they wind up just getting stuck in their cycle, back and forth. The more you do this, the more I do that. The more you do this, the more I do that. And they never actually resolve anything or connect through that process. So that's kind of how we would draw out that's a pretty typical negative disconnecting cycle between two people.
Yeah, some interesting things there. Like first, what you said about this is a generalized pattern, right, that we would see in relationships, and
Right.
I would say that we're in the exact same boat as you. Like if I were to look at my relationship with my wife, it is I tend to be more the pursuer and more the critical, and
Right.
she would be probably leaning more towards the avoiding and kind of need space and time and whatnot. But it's also one of the other things that I kind of recognized over traditional counseling is like, this is a space where, and this isn't what you do, but in the past, very typical responses to this would be discussing the way that we're communicating about the situation. Well, how does it make you feel when, this person does this? How does it make you, how do you think you can communicate that better? Instead of being this critical, what do you think you can say instead? As opposed to actually, like you said, looking underneath for root causes and why it's happening to begin with.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like, those first questions that you asked are helpful for mapping out the cycle. Like, okay, when she gets critical, what happens for you? Like, what are the messages you do receive? What is actually going on? Because she's probably not intending, or, in our case, when we might get critical, like, we're not intending to send a message that says, like, you're the worst and I don't love you and all that other disconnecting type language. We want to send a different message. And so I think asking the questions of like, what are the messages that we're getting? And then what is the emotional impact? Because if we can understand those things, then we naturally start to adjust maybe how we express ourselves. And we actually talk about what's real, because like the criticism given is oftentimes not what's actually like going on beneath it. Like, oh, you're always late. You always come home late. You're never on time. Okay, lots of criticism. But what's really going on for that person is, hey, I long to be close to you. You're important to me. I love it when you're here, right after work and we get to spend those moments together before, I don't know, soccer practice or whatever. Like, wow, that's actually the truth. The criticism is not the truth. You're missing, again, the whole story. It's kind of like the shame. I'm a loser. No, you're not a loser. There's something else beneath that. He's not a loser. She's not a loser. They're not wrong. They're missing the message. And so this helps us to understand the root cause and the core problems behind why we're disconnecting.
Yeah. I mean, you can almost say like a lot of times there is an underlying root cause or issue. Maybe it's frustration, anger, lack of connection, whatever it might be. And rather than thinking of like the symptomatic piece is like what's causing it, it's almost like going backwards. Like oftentimes we can feel something, we can feel a frustration and anger, and we simply look for an action to attach it to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We're not even like, we feel a general sense of lack of connection or frustration, and we look for something to actually place that frustration onto.
Totally. And that can even also be attached to things that maybe we kind of call these attachment injuries. So there's like this concept of like, you have an attachment between the two of you and it's either strong or it's weak. And sometimes it's bolstered and sometimes it's injured. And certain events can be kind of injuring. Maybe like if a person gets really sick and someone doesn't like show up for them, or in like an emotional moment, maybe like, I don't know, like at a parent's funeral or something, and they just don't feel like the person's emotionally available to support them. Like those can be pretty impactful. And sometimes we'll kind of put away those memories, but their effects will continue to ripple into our lives internally. And so we start to attach current events to that past feeling. Like I felt abandoned. Okay, I'm going to look for anything that feels abandoning now and link up to it. When really the issue is probably
they have nothing in common.
And it's probably back in time, right? It's probably back in something that's a little bit more injurious. And so, I think it is important to go a little deeper and start to understand where do these things come from.
Yeah, when we take a step back, and I like that you use the term attachment because it very much plays into specifically our own attachment styles, right? If we
Yeah.
are, and that's kind of the what you're describing right now too in the patterns is linking back to those attachment styles. Where are we
Oh yeah.
more avoidant in our attachment style? Are we more anxious in our attachment style?
Mhm.
And so we can kind of look at that and immediately identify patterns of how we're going to approach conflict and how we're going to,
Yeah.
either potentially stonewall or be critical in those
Mhm.
situations.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it could be something that's happened in our own relationship, or the way we respond, like you're saying, has to do with our early childhood experiences. Oh, I learned how to
Mhm.
cope with negative feedback or lack of attention from my parents by withdrawing, becoming a highly individualistic, shutting down. And so now I carry that into my relationship, right? Like this is an example,
Mhm.
maybe when someone does need some help or like things feel a little bit emotionally vulnerable or scary, I go to that place, I shut down, I withdraw, I move away. And that's another big piece to this whole pattern is understanding like, okay, there's patterns in our relationship that create conflict, but where did the pattern itself even come from? And that can be pretty eye-opening and provide a lot of runway for healing your own individual stuff as you bring it to the relationship.
That word to use, healing, is an interesting one because I think I feel like a lot of times, I guess I would say like a typical guy's perception of therapy, let's say
Mhm.
10 years ago, 20 years ago, or maybe even today, like maybe if they haven't like been around this, is like
Right.
that healing is these moments where you have these breakthroughs, and it can be,
Mhm.
but you start talking about something and you break down, you start crying, and you're healing your inner child. These concepts, but when you say healing, what is it to you?
Yeah, I think healing is it's so nuanced and different for other people, but it is well, I think there's different levels. Like you can heal things on the behavioral level where you're no longer doing things that are hurtful. It's like, okay, I have an awareness that I'm pretty defensive. I'm choosing not to be defensive. That's one layer. I think if we go a little bit deeper, then we have some sort of emotional experience on some level. And it doesn't have to be like I'm sitting there weeping, but it's just like, oh, wow, like that feels a little bit different. Maybe I see my partner a little deeper, or I see myself a little bit more compassion and understand those things. It doesn't have to be one catastrophic moment either. It can be a series of moments where you're like, oh,
Hmm.
I'm starting to feel a little bit more confident in myself. And so now I don't have to be defensive. Like I can just sit and listen and know that I'm okay. Like I don't have to defend myself. But I think deeper healing usually comes through some sort of experiential process where um and I mean logic can create levels of healing, but I think a lot of like deeply motivated long-term sustainable change comes when I experience something new that creates some sort of motivation or allows me to think, move, behave in a new way. I think is kind of how I would, I guess, conceptualize healing. And you see this between couples, right? It's like maybe there is that attachment injury, that thing that happened years and years ago. And just to rehash the past for no reason is definitely pointless. But I do
Hmm.
believe in healing the past. It's like, I still hold on to this. I want to let go of it because I love you, but it still hurts. And to be able to express it in a tender way, in a way that doesn't include, berating the person for what they did. Um, that creates emotional experiences. And that's what I see in my office. I'll actually have people, I'm like, wow, what you just told me, can you just turn it, tell it to him? Because that was pretty powerful. And that's healing. It's like, wow, we're seeing each other for the first time. I had no idea that that
Hmm.
impacted you. I'm feeling love for you. I'm feeling care for you. Now I have an awareness and an emotional motivation that's going to help me to change my behavior for the better. So I guess that's a really long, convoluted answer to what is healing.
No, I like it. I feel like healing is different for everybody, and most commonly, I would very much be in tune to kind of like what you just said right there in terms of like the way that we most commonly see healing from like a clinical standpoint, and even personally, is beginning with the awareness of something, and then
Mhm.
moving towards I would almost say like disempowering the triggering event
Yeah.
Like you're basically taking whatever it was in the past, whatever pain, whatever it was, and you're removing the power from that event to the point where it's not something that affects you anymore. And that's different from, like, let's say, the idea of like, the idea of forgiveness sometimes is confused with forgetting, like you forgive
Yeah.
and forget, right? But it's more like you forgive by simply removing the power. You take the sting away from the event, but you don't necessarily forget it.
Yeah.
That typically is like the healing response. Like when we see someone moves from awareness to like kind of processing to a place where eventually the sting is removed from that past pain.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I think those past pains are honestly so important because sometimes they can become building blocks for healing and connection. You think about, again, in the kind of the context of a relationship, when I'm working with a couple and they're like doing really well, a classic
Mhm.
fear is like, we're gonna start like at each other again, or like this isn't gonna work, it's gonna fall apart. And I'm like afraid this is gonna happen. And that makes sense, like being a little bit afraid of that. But I like to highlight how throughout the process, we tend to talk about hard stuff. We go back and look at painful moments. We change the narrative around those moments and change the experience to one that's associated with like my partner being there for me, them listening to that experience, holding me in my pain, understanding why it was impactful, seeing me as a human being in a respectful way. That memory has a new association. And so therefore it is no longer painful, but it is actually positive. They're like, I don't want to give that up. Like I would a lot of them would say like I'd never change those events. Like those
Mhm.
events and the healing that happened around them drew us close together. And so yeah, if you get back in your old pattern, if it happens, like great. Well, you know how to get out, and you know that the process of getting out, of reconnecting, is super bonding, is really healing and awesome. So don't worry about like fighting again or something like that happening. It can happen and you'll be okay. You'll be more than okay.
Yeah, I like that. We often talk about the actually triggering events. So when you are triggered, it's not necessarily a bad thing in the sense of like, I mean, it sucks being triggered,
Right.
but from the standpoint of you being triggered right now is an area that kind of it's a road sign. It kind of guides you back towards this is an area of personal pain that I still
Yeah.
need to work on. And we often think that like triggering events are for us to control external things like
Yeah.
no, you triggered me, so I need to change you need to stop doing that. But again, this doesn't really actually solve the problem, right? Even if you can force somebody to not trigger you, it doesn't take away all the other people that you cannot control in your life.
Yeah.
So these triggers can be very purposeful in terms of like ongoing conflict and things that's going to, of course, happen. But every time it does, you have a very direct road sign to where exactly you need to focus your effort on.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And if you know what your triggers are, and if you know what your more disconnecting response could be to those triggers, if let's say you mapped out your cycle like we talked about in the beginning, hey, when my partner does this, that kind of fires me up, and when I get fired up in that way, um, which really underneath it is probably like when I get hurt that way, I respond this way. That's my negative response. At the end of the day, you can influence your partner, but you cannot control them. And so I always tell people,
Mhm.
I'm like, especially from like an online stance, when I'm speaking to individuals, right? It's like we're not sharing an Instagram account. I mean, some couples do, but it's pretty rare. I pop up. My message is not for your partner. My message is for you. Like all you can
Yeah.
do is take control of the things that you can control and learn to. This is kind of a tenet from Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step groups. Like control that which you can and learn how to let go and kind of surrender the things you cannot control because it will do you no good to fight and fret over those things. So instead of going to controlling what you do, instead of going to that criticism, slow down, look at the bottom of the cycle and go, okay, what am I actually feeling? Am I actually feeling like rage? Okay, maybe on the surface, but am I feeling something a little bit more tender? Am I feeling hurt? Am I feeling loneliness? What am I needing? Can I ask for my need instead of like getting critical and just beating this person up over here? Or can I like make a positive reach for my need to be met? I think that's what it looks like when you notice your triggers, know how you respond, and then choose actively to respond differently to them. And that's taking control. That's taking power. And even if your partner is not on board at all to change their side of the
Mhm.
cycle at this point, dude, you can make an incredible impact on your relationship, even if you change. You're half that cycle. That's a big percentage.
Yeah. Well, criticism being one of the negative patterns that people fall
One,
into. Um, Going into that a little bit more, if you were to unpack that, what do you typically? Because I know my response to this, but I'm kind of curious on a clinical side.
mhm.
What do you typically see in the criticizer in
What do
terms
you
of
mean?
like in terms of the person that is typically criticizing the other?
Yeah.
What do you typically see in terms of that person's own work and things that they need to do, and in comparison to the things that they're criticizing?
Yeah. Oh, that's a big question. But I feel like in terms of their work, oftentimes um, they need to they need to lay down the protect like lay down their protective mechanisms, because criticism is
Mm,
oftentimes a protection, and it protects, and same with withdrawing. Honestly, they're both protecting the same thing. um, they're protecting the relationship, the closeness. They're protecting the idea that says, like, I want to protect the view that you have of me. I want you to believe that I'm a good person, that you love me, that you care about me, and that you want me close. I'm afraid to lose that. Usually at the heart of all of this, when we peel back the layers, we get below the criticism, and I can soften the criticism, and I'm working with maybe just that person, and I'm kind of like, hey, talk to me. Don't talk to that guy over there right now or that girl. Like, just tell me. And I kind of get down into the fears. Usually it's some sort of fear-based protective mechanism. And if they can
mm,
honor that fear, recognize it, and learn how to respond differently in a way that actually invites their partner. We go back to the you're home late example. You're home late, you never do this right. Well, that's just pushing them away. It's the opposite of an invite.
mhm,
But if we go to the truth, I'm sometimes I'm just a little bit afraid that, like, you don't care about me. And this feels like evidence. And it's really cool, even if they throw in a little benefit of the doubt. Like, I know it's probably not. Like, I know you're probably busy, but this is just what it feels like. You're important to me. I love you and I want you close. Whoa, way different message for that person. They're not hearing that they're wrong or they're stupid or they're not going to ever get it right anymore. They're hearing, wow, he or she really cares about me. They like really, really care about me, to the point where it's painful, like, for them sometimes when we feel so disconnected. That's more encouraging. So it has an impact on the cycle, but the individual work is, I think, recognizing fear, honoring fear, and learning how to cope with fear in a new way
mm.
for both withdrawing and criticizing and pursuing. It's a similar process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially criticism when it comes from a standpoint of someone who is more anxious.
Hmm.
What would you say from like the criticism that comes from someone that may be more avoidant and perhaps more narcissistic, where
Yeah.
their criticism is more leveled at like doing things my way, and this is, how I think it's right, and this is why you're wrong.
Yeah. Honestly, I think it comes back down to fears again. It's like fear of, maybe it's different, but like fear of being unimportant, fear of abandonment is usually tied up in things like narcissistic type behaviors or borderline type behaviors. And not to say that withdrawing is strictly in that camp. Usually it's a mix of
Hmm.
criticism and withdraw. But or oftentimes I hear from guys where, once we kind of boil it down, uh if they withdraw and pull out of a conversation and it drives her crazy, when I boil it down, he's like, I'm just afraid. Like, I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. Okay, why are you afraid of saying the wrong thing? Well, I'm afraid of essentially losing her. I'm afraid of being alone. I'm afraid of this not working, or me not being valued or
Hmm.
important. And yeah, I think when people start honoring their fears and being real about it, they can start figuring out, okay, how do I manage this fear better? Maybe I'm not going to do things like manipulate or withdraw or criticize or what have you. They get an open door to choose, how do I want to cope with this fear of not being good enough and being injured and all of that huge list of things you could be afraid of within a relationship.
Yeah, that being injured piece is a big one that I think people tend to dismiss a lot from like a narcissistic interaction of like,
Mhm.
and this isn't to say like narcissism is a I always feel like I have to clarify. This is a spectrum of behavior, right?
Huge.
Of narcissism. And it's a vast spectrum of behavior, from one side of just being narcissistic to the other side of being sociopathic. Like, we're talking broad, but in general, a narcissist or someone that's avoidant, that is criticizing, I think a lot of people don't realize that also comes from, like you said, a fear of protection, of injury. And it goes back again to like, well, a lot of narcissistic tendencies develop when a child is basically left to protect themselves, right? When they're left to, it could be because the parent is dismissive. It could be because, for whatever reason, the parent is not available. So the child kind of learns that it's me, myself, and I. I'm the one that protects. I'm the one that takes care of. And that sense of control is often, exerted through criticism and critique of somebody else, because that's the way that they maintain control and power. And that's what people recognize, that it's for control and power, but they don't realize it's for control and power to protect themselves from injury.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And it's a tricky landscape, because there's kind of this mix when we think about, okay, how do I get out of these control and power type responses, and withdrawing and shutting down to try to manipulate somebody into pursuing you. That's a narcissistic type trait, or heavily criticizing somebody, narcissistic type trait. So we all got them. We're right. It's like we got a little bit of narcissism in us at some point if we do any of those things, even in the most gentle way, and that's okay. It's not okay to stay there, right? It's to change it. And I think there's kind of two. If we conceptualize two paths to changing it, we talk about self-regulation and co-regulation. And I think the narrative around this has gotten a little jumbled over the last few years, where like people get all hyped up on their high horse of codependency, or like anti-codependency, where like they don't understand that, okay, well, you're in an interdependent relationship where you do need to like rely on one another. And so part of this is, okay, asking, let's say the opposite of criticizing or withdrawing. A good thing to do always is like actually ask for what you need. Be really clear. That's kind of like boundary setting in ways. That is a positive behavior that is probably on the co-regulation side. You're asking for a little bit of help. You're asking for them to show up, to maybe validate one of your needs, or to listen to you. That is going to help. That'll break the cycle in a way. And by asking, you're opening the door for a more positive cycle to begin, in a sense. So you're doing your own work there, and you're making it easier for your partner to move into more positive interaction with you. So there's like co-regulation. But if you're expecting all your problems to be solved through co-regulation, that's where we get into maybe a trending towards a codependent type state. The other element is that self-regulation, deciding like, oh, hey, this is a pattern that I've had since I was a kid. I notice it coming up. I notice this feeling. I'm going to do whatever work, whatever you're into, whatever works for you. I'm going to do some breath work. I'm going to do some journaling. I'm going to do something, or maybe I'm not expressing it to my partner right now. If it gets to a point where through my journaling, through my meditation and breath work, or whatever you're doing, I get to a point where I feel like I have a good way of honoring the truth when expressing it to my partner, and I can do it in a healthy way, cool. Then you're going to shift back into co-regulation and start sharing. Hey, this is how that made me feel when you said this thing, or when this happened. And I just want to let you know, because you're important to me and it has an impact on me. Okay, so we're going to do both. We're going to flip back and forth. What's my co-regulation? What's my attempt my attempt at co-regulation, and what's my attempt at self-regulation? And choosing to move back and forth in between both of those states, I think, is a really important part of managing those fears when it comes to these relationships.
Yeah, co-regulation is an incredibly powerful tool, and I tend to think of it like, I agree with you that people are terrified of codependency to the point where like they don't realize that co-regulation is actually a very healthy thing, and it's a kind of a necessary thing for relationships. But I tend to differentiate the two with like codependency is this idea of I'm looking to you to solve my issue, right? As opposed to co-regulation, which is I'm actually, most of my effort is focused on self-regulation, 80% or so. And 20% of the time I might help, not judge, not be critical, but when you're in a place that's that I know is challenging for you, I'm going to help shine the light there and just say, hey, honey, like this is an area that you might be feeling triggered right now. Like this,
Right.
hey, like this is might be one of the spots, and you support from that standpoint.
Yeah.
But it's still 20% of the effort is like, I'm just going to help you to be aware of this. 80% is focused still on self-regulation.
Totally. Yeah. And it's funny because there's a lot of, you kind of get two camps, and I reference, social media again, because we both do a lot of that and shooting videos there. And there's kind of two camps of people. Those who are like, you see them in the comments, they're like, oh, this is awesome. Like, I'm going to change something. I'm like, do something for me. Like, good reminder. Thank you. And then there's those that just like blast their partner. They're like, oh, my partner does this. They're the worst, whatever. And it's like, oh, man, I just feel bad because they're not.
They'll share it and be like, this is what I was telling you.
Yeah, exactly. They're like tagging in the
Happens all
comments.
the
You're like, oh no, please. But yeah, I think they've got their ratios like mixed up, right? Maybe instead of 80-20, it's 20-80 or 100% on their partner in their mind. And to those people, I just say, well, you're probably not even listening to this podcast. So, if you're those people, you're probably not listening. But it's like a big message I've just been fixed on lately is that you can change your relationship. You absolutely can. Like if all you do is just stop blaming your partner and start looking inward, and there can be some pain there because maybe your partner is doing some jacked up stuff that does not work. Well, okay, you know what that is. You've been looking at it and you've been complaining about it for so many years. You don't have to talk about it anymore because you know what it is. We can put that on the shelf, write it down in a journal and close it, and then turn inward and go, okay, what does my self-regulation look like? And how does my self-regulation lead to making it easier, maybe, for my partner to engage in healthy co-regulation with me? If I'm softer in my criticism and I'm inviting, or maybe I'm less withdrawn and I show up emotionally, okay, yeah, that's self-regulation that opens the door for easier co-regulation because your partner is going to be able to respond to that much better than your withdrawal or your criticism.
Well, let's take that exact conversation over to the flip side of like, well, on the receiving end of criticism, we can stonewall or we can be defensive. So if we go into the defensive route, right? Expecting your partner to be able to, I can co-regulate, with my partner to the extent of like, hey, honey, I don't want you to be defensive right now. I'm just pointing something out. But that's basically it. Beyond simply the awareness piece, it is 100% pure self-regulation for my partner to not be defensive in that moment, or for me to not be defensive in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. You do everything you can and know that like, hey, I've shown up as my best self, and I get to kind of let go of control at that point. Because as soon as you start going into trying to control, you're going to slip back into your negative patterns, your defensiveness, your criticism, and all that. When you let the fear get a hold of you, and you start resorting to what you have felt like is the solution, which is actually your problem. I always tell people, your problem is your solution, your attempted solution. That is where the majority of your issues are coming from, is what you're trying to do. It just creates it. So
yeah, I want to give you a case study to analyze. I love stories and case studies, and I feel like our audience does too. So we'll give you one, but on the defensive side. And it's funny because like sometimes people can get defensive or even be triggered without even any sort of like provocation, right? So this is kind of an example of one of those. But a man and a woman in a relationship, the woman loses 25 pounds. And to celebrate, the woman asks the man, and this is an actual case study. I'm just kind of thinking to make sure I remove all the names and all the pieces of this that would make anything identifiable. But the woman asked the man, let's go out and buy something that's 25 pounds to celebrate. And the guy goes, cool, let's do that. So they go to the store, and at the store, she's like, what should we get? And he goes, why don't we get a 25-pound kettlebell? And immediately she goes, you still think I'm fat, don't you? And this is the basis of like where it starts to devolve, because he goes, why would you think that? Well, because you want me to get a kettlebell, which means that you obviously want me to work out more. And he says, well, no, I didn't. I was thinking kettlebell because it's useful. You are enjoying working out. So like that would be something that you would actually use. And she goes, no, that's the first thing that came to your mind because you want me to lose more weight. And he asks, well, what would you want me to say? And then she says, I would expect that you'd say something like, well, let's go buy a 20-pound or 25-pound bag of rice. He goes, but you don't eat rice. So this is where we basically get involved into this. But that was the beginning of this conversation
Yeah.
and argument.
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, you're identifying what are the pieces to this cycle that's happening right now. Defensiveness met with defensiveness. And here's the thing is that, or her defensiveness probably sounds a bit more blatant and strong. We can hear it. At least I can hear it maybe a little bit easier in this. But you look at like sometimes just explaining yourself or trying to give reassurance before offering up understanding and compassion can sound like defensiveness. And it is defensiveness. Like, no, well, I was doing this and I was trying to do this. He's just justifying his position. Right now, she's in a hurt emotional state, right? Whether it makes sense or not, right? I'm not going to judge that right now. I want to know, where is she? She's in an emotional state that in some level is hurt. She's not honoring that hurt. She's just coming at him with like criticism and defensiveness. Okay. And so he skips the hurt and goes straight to the, well, hold on, let me explain this with good reason, right? That sounds like it could be helpful. And I think it could be in the long run. But if I were to say, what are both of your individual responsibilities? I'm kind of starting on him because he was defensive in response, and it might be easy to skip that guy because it's like, man, she got pretty defensive pretty quick. Like, that wasn't cool. But I want to start with him and say, hey, what do you have the opportunity to do? You have the opportunity to let go of defensiveness and just honor your partner's experience. Okay, I'm going to offer some understanding and some compassion. It doesn't mean I agree with you. It doesn't mean that I was saying that you're fat or any of that other stuff. That's not true. But am I going to honor what you're actually feeling, what's actually underneath the surface? Yeah, what's underneath the surface is that not that I'm an idiot for saying that I'm bad, that I'm stupid, or that you even think those things, but that you feel a little bit sensitive in this area and that hurts. Okay, maybe I can honor that truth. Boom. Flip side for her, honoring the fact that like, wow, self-regulation. I'm noticing that I'm feeling defensive, that awareness piece. I'm feeling like I want to bite back at that comment. That hurts. Why does it hurt? Well, I've put a lot of work into this. I've maybe been insecure about the way I look in the past. Can I honor those things? Be a little compassionate on myself. So, it makes sense. I'm feeling a little defensive, but it's not going to be helpful. What can I do? Like, can I honor my other partner's experience? Oh, what benefit of the doubt can I give him? What is he maybe feeling in his request? And choosing, again, they both have self-regulating to do in those moments, honoring what is the fear. Oh, she thinks I'm a bozo. She thinks I'm not good enough, and that's why she's criticizing me. Oh, he thinks I'm not thin enough. He doesn't like me the way I am. This hurts, and that's scary. If I honor that fear and slow everything down, I'm not going to get defensive. I'm going to be much more soft and engaged in that standpoint.
Yeah, it's interesting because in those types of moments, especially when you feel like someone is being completely illogical, when you know that they're just simply acting off of like a trigger, it's hard to slow yourself down. So in that moment, what would a healthy co-regulated response be on the part of the man?
Oh, dude, I think just thinking about like, you have your wife here who you love and honor the most right now is not your opportunity to school her on how she should have responded. Because, and sure, she might need it, but is it going to work? No. So let's go to what's effective and what's ineffective. What's effective is going, oh, hold on. What message did I send? I love this question. What message did I send to her just there? Maybe I didn't mean to. Totally. That's fine. But I don't need to defend myself right now. Like, I'm good. Like, I'm okay. And I think going, oh, hold on. You know what? This kind of makes sense. You've put a lot of work into this. I could see how what I said could feel like I was criticizing you or saying that you're not enough or you didn't do it right or whatnot. Like, I'm sorry that it feels that way. That must be hard. That is, or even just reflecting back. Oh, so what I'm hearing you say to me is that, talking about how she hurts in that moment or what's happening for her. And then when she feels understood, she's going to be way more open to the reassurance / explanation. And it changes from defensiveness to reassurance and explanation if she first feels understood. Because it's pretty reassuring to say, hey, I definitely didn't mean that in that way. Not at all. My mind was thinking this way, that, you might want to work out some more. You're excited about it. You're really into it. And I was trying to support you. I could see how that could be a little mixed up, though. I just want you to know that's where I'm coming from. And she can hear that at that point, like, oh, yeah, okay, that's cool. It allows her, like I said before, when you self-regulate and then you reach for a co-regulation, your efforts of self-regulation have made it easier for your partner to participate in healthy co-regulation. He engaged in empathetic listening, understanding, validating, being present without going to defensiveness. And now she is more capable of listening to his explanation from the standpoint of reassurance rather than from a standpoint of defensiveness. That's what I would talk to him about.
I love it. I do want to point out that, like, for anybody that is going to use these techniques, that it's important to probably say that these work in healthy relationship dynamics. If you are in a situation where one person is highly manipulative, they could potentially use that against you, right? Like if you were to try to respond in an understanding and compassionate manner to somebody that is narcissistic and manipulative to that extent,
right,
it could very likely go the other way.
For sure. And you have to be aware of that and watch for it. Because it's like, hey, if I'm softening, if I'm reaching, if I'm allowing space for this person and they're just taking that space rather than giving me space as well, that's good information that says maybe this is not a good place for me to be. Maybe this relationship is not okay. And that comes back down to, again, owning it, taking 100% ownership for your relationship. That it means co-regulating, self-regulating, showing up, and then owning the decision, if needs be, to step away from it and not stay in a victim stance. I hate when people are just like, oh, I'm a victim forever. It's like, no, you're not. You're only a victim. I mean, you are a victim on some levels. I'm not meaning to minimize abuse or anything of that nature. And it is very hard when you are wrapped up in the manipulation of somebody else to see the truth that, like, you are a good person. If you're under the guise of, like, gaslighting or influence or of manipulation in any way, it's hard to see the exit point. But being able to notice maybe some of these patterns could be helpful. Okay, when I reach, when I make space, I soften, I get compassionate, and then that space is just taken. Maybe I am being manipulated. Maybe this is a pattern. Maybe I do need to get some second pair of eyes on this, or maybe I need to exit this relationship. You kind of get some information to be able to start asking those questions. If the pattern is that you give space and you receive none really, really consistently. I mean, some people can not give space in return at moments, and that can happen. Like, okay, we're not perfect, but if it's really consistent, I'd be kind of careful about what's going on there.
For sure. Well, I loved your response on that defensiveness side, because I do feel like that particular case is so clear cut that most people would jump straight to, well, she's in the wrong and this is why. And I loved your response, because it was completely like the first opportunity to co-regulate is on his side, actually. And like, because she's already, when one person in the dynamic has already gotten triggered, the first opportunity is on the other side. It's not on that side, because you've immediately passed that place of, like, being able to reason and be able to be logic, because they're already triggered.
Yep.
So I love how you caught that and reference it back to him.
Yeah.
What are some other common negative patterns? I mean, a lot of this really goes back to a lot of Gottman's research, the Gottman Institute's research of stonewalling, defensiveness, and criticism. And what does he call that one? He had a really funny term for basically the negative goggles that you see every action through. No, contempt was the last step. There was it was a negative bias. I forgot. He has a really, him and his wife had this, they come up with fancy terms, and this one was one of the funnier ones.
Negative sentiment override, or
negative sentiment
like
override. Yes. Yep. Yes. NSO.
Yeah.
That one was, I was like, just negative goggles would be helpful.
I like negative goggles. Yeah, that's
negative
better.
Goggles.
Write them a letter.
No, they do great work.
Yes.
What other common patterns did you want to kind of talk about that you typically see in your clinical work?
honestly, we've been talking about them like throughout, and I think if we, this is where I feel like emotionally focused therapy and Gottman kind of mash up a little bit,
Hmm.
where emotionally focused therapy is big on understanding conflict from the standpoint of attachment and those
Mm.
messages that are sent back and forth. Do I feel safe? Do I feel comfortable? Do I feel supported? Do I get messages that say, I love you, you love me, we're on the same team, that kind of stuff. If
Hmm.
we can send those messages consistently and wade through all of the context and garbage of the conflict, then we will start to feel more connected and safe and secure as a byproduct of that process. Um, and Gottman does a really good job at labeling like what's on top of the cycle, stonewall, criticism,
Hmm.
defensiveness, the contempt type behaviors. And so really I think we've kind of touched on pretty much the overarching themes. And if you want to reference both of these, going to Gottman's Four Horsemen and then
Hmm.
understanding the negative cycle through like EFT, that's kind of where we've been dabbling all throughout today's conversation.
I love that. I like among this newer generation of therapists, yourself and Matthias and the people that we
Hmm.
are fortunate to surround ourselves with. Everybody's starting to realize that there is a purpose in each one of these modalities. That like
Hmm.
to properly treat somebody, you really need to understand EFT. You need to understand Gottman's approach.
Hmm.
When we created CVFT, it was the core value focus therapy. It was
Yeah,
of the mind of let's bring them all together around a centralized concept of core values, and let's build around that. But we try to incorporate each of the models because in every relationship that you look at, there are multiple points where you need other modalities of therapy. Like you
for
need to
sure.
sometimes go back to attachment. Sometimes there are inner child issues that have to be addressed, but
Yeah,
a lot of times they're not. A lot of times it's
right.
more like, what are the results of what's going on? And let's go straight to Gottman. Look, this is defensiveness and criticism. And
Right.
so it's all critical in this overview.
Yeah, and that's I think the difference between like a integrated approach to therapy,
Hmm.
a really linear approach, and like a just eclectic, like chaotic approach. Some people are like, "Oh, I'm integrative," and they're like mashing up all these models, but it doesn't follow any kind of like a flow or a process, which can be really confusing for a client. And there's not a lot of direction. They're just like throwing things at the wall, hoping something will fix a person. And I don't even like that term, but help them, I guess I should say. Then there's that really linear kind of pigeonholed model where it's like, oh, I am only a Gottman therapist, or I'm only a cognitive behavioral therapist. It's like, man, you're missing out on a ton of really good research in other places that has already been done that shows this is work,
Very much
this
so.
works. And what's funny is that I honestly feel like, so I study all of the models pretty in depth throughout my master's program. It's part of like licensing. You got to know basically all of them and how to perform within all of them and be able to show like, hey,
Mm.
I'm doing this right now. And as I do it, I start to realize they're almost all the same. Like they just use different
Hmm.
words for the same thing. They're all very, very similar. With the exception of, I think, a lot of like somatic type therapies where you're like really getting the body involved. You're doing like a lot of breathing, or like in some cases, like even like shaking and some stuff that um, seems a little strange on its face, but has a really good research behind it.
Sure.
But yeah, they're all pretty much the same. They're very, very, very similar, if not.
Yeah, I like it, and I feel like this is a great just kind of opportunity because I'm curious as far as I'm curious myself as far as you have the connection course, or is it the connection club?
Yeah, so
Or
it's the connection course, and you have access to the Better Relationship Club. So the Better Relationship Club is
got it.
like a community, private community built on its own like private app, and you also get to join me on my podcast, like asking questions, not like show up in the video, but through the chat, and some other cool benefits as part of like being part of the club. And then the connection course is one of the backbone like courses or the curriculum that's part of that whole Better Relationship Club connection course combo.
Awesome. Can you, in talking about that, I'm very curious to your approach within
Yeah.
this program.
Hmm. Yeah, so it touches a lot of the principles that we've talked about today. From the very beginning, people aren't motivated to do things like finish online courses, let alone start them. Like
Yeah.
you look at the data, and
Yeah.
it's terrible. And so, with that in mind, the first little bit is just some modules based around increasing feelings of motivation and drive to do the
Mm.
work, utilizing research backed approaches such as motivational interviewing and some other activities that you kind of engage in. Then we start to move into this idea of, okay, where do some of my maybe insecurities come from in my relationship? And that goes back to attachment, the little me kind of work. Like what was it like growing up? What insecurities did I bring into the world? What kind of questions about love or the way I see love and closeness, and heightening awareness around that, because that's going to impact your relationship. And then we spend a lot of time bringing more awareness to that negative cycle, really understanding the deeper root causes behind that disconnection. And then it moves into, and this is kind of chronologically through the connection course, it moves into a place where you're actually learning how to break those negative patterns. Similar to what we've talked about today, but in a way that's really concrete. Some of it has to do with just, hey, you communicate things in a different way, or you communicate about different things that are deeper in the cycle, you will be more
Mm.
successful. And I teach you how to actually do that, how to show up. Even again, if your partner refuses to make any change, you can make some significant changes by heightening that awareness and then bringing it to the table through the way you actually interact with your partner, and also kind of interact with yourself internally, that self-regulation piece. And then towards the end, we kind of sprinkle in some bonuses on some some scripts in a way that I use for
Mm.
couples, especially when there's been some sort of lack of trust or there's a disconnection. And it's kind of like a conversation to have daily, like that creates a lot of connection and closeness, and allows you to keep those doors or the pathways of communication open, and some other fun just add-ons. And then when as you're going through it, when you get done, you get to participate in the Better Relationship Club, which is a place where you can anonymously, and this is why we don't do it on Facebook, you can anonymously,
Mhm.
if you want, you can change your name, post about your wins, ask questions, share, things, relate to others, and join in on the Art of Healing podcast as kind of a viewer participant, where you get to ask questions of, expert guests, speakers, and people that I bring on. So that's kind of the whole process of how we work through going from not knowing what to do to like really empowering you to transform your relationship, even if you're, the only one working on it. If your partner joins you, that's awesome, but it's not required.
I love that. I'm going to have to pick your brain on a side note on the group side, because we've tried to do a very similar thing, but Facebook is like the main place to do it. But then the main issue you run into is just, it's hard to get people to participate
It's
when
hard.
everyone knows actual names. It's not anonymous. So
Yeah.
that's fascinating. I'm going to have Anthony, we will link up everything. So if you guys are on YouTube, you can actually check out the description. We're going to link up Trevor's Instagram, as well as the Connection course and the Better Relationship Club. If you guys are just listening to the podcast, then probably the best place is just to go to your Instagram, right, Trevor?
Yeah. Yeah. Just go to my Instagram, go to the link in my bio. And that same link will just, I'll have you put that link in the YouTube as well, because it's dynamic. It changes if I update the location of the Connection course, it'll all be there. So go to my Instagram,
Cool.
link in my bio has everything you want, from like reaching out to me to finding my courses and other freebies that I offer.
Awesome. And it's at the Art of Healing by Trevor. Just
Yeah. Yep.
wait,
At the Art of
.com.
Healing. Yeah. At the Art of Healing by Trevor. Yeah.
Okay.
I had to have a really long username because the Art of Healing was taken at the time, and I guess I didn't have enough creative bandwidth to change my name at that point.
No, I love it, dude. Well, I could talk with you for days, man. So we're gonna have to do this again. But in the
Okay.
meantime, thanks for joining us.
Of course. Thank you, man. Next time I'll be in person. I'll have to come down and say hi to you guys.
It needs to be in person for sure. Let me know
Let's do
next
it.
time you're here.
Okay. Thank you.